My parents yelled at me so loudly in my own living room that my new neighbors probably thought someone was being robbed. "How could you buy a four-bedroom house without telling us?" My mother screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've just ruined?" I stood there, holding the key to the first home I had ever bought with my own hard-earned money, completely stunned. I thought they would be proud. Instead, they looked at me like I had committed treason. It wasn't until my father let it slip a few minutes later that the horrifying truth came out. They had already promised my new house to my older sister, her freeloading husband, and their 3 kids, without ever asking me. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Diana Thornton. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 6 years, my entire life revolved around a single goal: owning a place that was truly mine. I worked late shifts, cut out vacations, and saved every single dollar I could spare. So when the day finally came that I closed on a beautiful 4-bedroom house, I was practically floating. It had a big backyard, a cozy fireplace, and room enough for me to finally breathe. I decided to invite my parents over for dinner under the pretense of a simple get-together, wanting to surprise them with the ultimate reveal. I had visions of my mother tearing up with pride and my father giving me a tight hug, praising how hard I'd worked. When they stepped through the front door, my mom's eyes immediately darted around the spacious entry hall. But instead of excitement, her face darkened. My dad stood beside her, arms crossed, staring at the high ceilings as if he'd just walked into a crime scene. "Diana," my mother snapped, her voice cold enough to freeze the room. "Whose house is this?" I proudly pulled out my key ring and held up the shining brass key. "It's mine, Mom. I bought it. All 4 bedrooms." I expected a cheer. Instead, my father's face turned bright red, his jaw clenching so tight I thought his teeth might break. Before I could even ask what was wrong, my mother erupted into a sharp scream that echoed across the empty walls, looking at me with pure, unadulterated fury. "How could you buy a 4-bedroom house without telling us?" My mother shrieked, her voice shaking the empty living room. "Do you have any idea what you've just ruined?" I stood frozen, the brass key feeling heavy and cold in my palm. "Ruined? Mom, I bought a house. I've been saving for 6 years. Why are you screaming at me?" My father took an aggressive step forward, pointing a finger directly at my chest. "Because you were supposed to consult us first. You don't just go out and make a massive purchase like this on a whim, Diana. A 4-bedroom house for one person? It's absurd. It wasn't on a whim, and it's my money." I yelled back, tears of frustration stinging my eyes. "Why on earth would I need your permission to buy my own home?" My mother let out a bitter, sarcastic laugh and threw her hands in the air. "Because your sister is being evicted, Diana. That's why." The words hung in the air like poison. Maya, my older sister, and her husband, Greg, had been struggling for years, mostly because Greg refused to hold down a job for more than 2 months, and Maya expected everyone else to fund their lifestyle. They had 3 kids, a mountain of debt, and 0 savings. Maya and Greg's lease ends next month, and they have nowhere to go, my father said, his tone shifting from anger to an eerie, demand-driven entitlement. "We've been planning this for 3 months. We were going to help you look for a property together, a place big enough so Maya, Greg, and the kids could move in with you. And now you've gone and bought this deed strictly in your own name." I stared at my parents in utter disbelief, the shock turning into a cold, sharp anger in my chest. "You planned for 5 people to move into my home without even asking me?" "They're family, Diana," my mother snapped, folding her arms. "What else were you going to do with 4 bedrooms? Live in luxury while your sister and her children end up on the street? You don't need all this space for just yourself." "Greg hasn't held a steady job in 3 years," I said firmly, my voice dead serious. "Maya refuses to cut back on her spending, and every time someone helps them, they take complete advantage. I am not turning my first home into a rent-free shelter for a grown man who refuses to work." My father's face darkened, his voice dropping into a dangerous glare. "So that's it? You're going to let your own nieces and nephews suffer because of your pride? We raised you to care about this family, Diana. You're being selfish, cold-hearted, and arrogant." I am 34 years old, I replied, stepping toward the front door and opening it wide. I earned every single brick of this house with my own sweat and long hours. I am not paying for Maya's mistakes, and I am certainly not letting you guilt-trip me in my own living room. You'll regret this, my mother hissed, her eyes blazing with fury as she walked past me into the night. You're turning your back on blood, and mark my words, this family will not forget it. I locked the door behind them, my hands shaking, knowing the real war had only just begun. Over the next 48 hours, my phone turned into a relentless war zone. It started with a barrage of text messages from Maya, each one more hostile than the last. How could you do this to my kids? One message read. You have 4 bedrooms sitting empty while my children are about to be homeless. You are a monster, Diana. Greg even tried calling me, leaving a passive-aggressive voicemail claiming he was deeply disappointed that I was letting my ego come between family. I didn't reply to a single message. I knew that engaging with them would only fuel their outrage. Then came the flying monkeys. Aunts, uncles, and distant cousins, people I hadn't spoken to in months, suddenly began reaching out to offer their unwanted opinions. My Aunt Linda called me at work, lecturing me about the sanctity of family bonds, and asking if I really felt comfortable sleeping in a large house while my sister struggled. That was when I learned the most infuriating detail of all. During a brief call with my cousin Sarah, the full truth came out. My parents hadn't just hoped Maya would move in. They had actively promised her that my new house was practically hers. Your mom told everyone at Sunday dinner last month that you were buying a big place specifically for Maya's family, Sarah confessed, her voice filled with genuine pity. She said you were single, didn't need all that space, and that it was your duty as a daughter to house them. My blood ran cold. They had traded away my future, my independence, and my hard work without my knowledge, treating my life savings like a shared family bank account. 3 days later was my grandmother's 85th birthday party at a popular local restaurant. I almost stayed home to avoid the inevitable drama, but I loved my grandma dearly and refused to let my parents ruin her special day. I walked into the private dining room wearing a calm, composed smile, determined to keep the peace. For the first hour, things were tense, but manageable. My parents completely ignored me, and Maya glared at me from across the room every time she filled her glass. I stayed close to Grandma, chatting about her garden and enjoying the afternoon. But as dessert was being served, my father tapped his glass with a fork to call for everyone's attention. Before we wrap up, my dad announced, his voice ringing across the quiet room, we need to address a situation that is breaking our family apart. My stomach dropped into a leaden weight as every eye in the room turned toward me. As many of you know, my father continued, putting a comforting arm around a tearful Maya. Maya and her family are facing an impossible housing crisis. Meanwhile, Diana here has just purchased a massive 4-bedroom house, all by herself. My mother stepped forward, her face a mask of grief and fake sorrow. We asked Diana to open her heart and her empty rooms to her own flesh and blood. But she refused. She would rather let her young nieces and nephew suffer on the street than share her blessing. Gasps echoed around the table. Maya started sobbing loudly into a napkin while Greg shook his head in bitter disappointment. They had backed me into a corner in front of 20 family members, expecting me to crumble under the public shame. I stood up slowly from my chair, feeling every gaze in the room locking onto me. The silence was suffocating, but I didn't break down or lower my eyes. Since you decided to make my personal finances public entertainment, I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly across the restaurant, let's talk about the actual truth. I turned directly toward Maya and Greg. Over the last 4 years, I've given you over $12,000 to help pay your rent, cover your utility bills, and buy groceries for the kids. Where did that money go, Greg? Did it go toward finding a steady job, or did it go toward your daily video games and takeout meals? Greg flushed bright red, opening his mouth to speak, but I didn't let him interrupt. And, Mom, Dad, you promised my house to Maya without asking me because you knew Greg wouldn't work and you didn't want to house 5 people in your own living room. You expected me to work 60 hours a week, so I could finance their lazy lifestyle. A heavy silence fell over the room as my relatives looked between my furious parents and Greg's guilty face. The tide was turning instantly. Suddenly, Grandma slammed her teacup down onto its saucer with a sharp click. She turned her fierce glare toward my parents and Maya. "That is enough," Grandma snapped, her voice trembling with indignation. "Diana worked her fingers to the bone for that house. How dare you try to humiliate her at my party to cover up your own failure to raise responsible adults? Maya, you and Greg need to grow up." Humiliated and exposed, my parents, Maya, and Greg gathered their things in silence and fled the restaurant, unable to face the room. In the weeks that followed, the silence from my parents and sister was the best gift I could have ever received. I placed my parents and Maya on a strict low-contact boundary, blocking their social media accounts and refusing to answer any phone calls that began with demands or guilt trips. Without my savings to rely on as an endless safety net, Maya and Greg were finally forced to face reality. Instead of relying on handouts, Greg was forced to take a full-time job at a local warehouse, and they moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment that they could actually afford on their own. It turns out they were completely capable of taking care of themselves once nobody was willing to enable them. As for me, I spent my evenings painting the walls of my new 4-bedroom home, filling the rooms with soft furniture, warm lighting, and beautiful green plants. Walking through my peaceful, quiet house after a long day of work brings me a sense of pride that no amount of family guilt could ever take away. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Blood might make you related, but respect is what makes you family. Now, I'm curious about you who are listening to my story. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have let family move in or stood your ground? Comment below with your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching until the end.